Hello, welcome to VLGA Connect, brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, another of our weekly episodes with news from around the sector and special guests discussing current issues of interest. Coming up today, Tony Ranik is here in just a few moments from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. We have a bit to catch up on since our last chat, including that parking fine error at Merri-bek Council and recent election-related decisions from VCAT. And later in the show, Matt Collins from the Planning Institute of Australia will tell us about their recent survey, which highlights the severe shortage of qualified planners and how it's impacting councils and service delivery right across the country. But first, let's catch up with this week's VLGA Connect news. An administrative error dating back more than 10 years has led to a decision by Merri-bek Council to refund parking fine revenue collected since 2013. The council this week announced it would launch a parking refund scheme relating to 11 minor types of infringements incurred up until last week. It was recently discovered that no formal resolution was in place to set a 0.5 penalty unit for those infringements, which is higher than the default rate of 0.2 penalty units. The total refund figure has been estimated at between $10 and $12.4 million. More on that issue with Tony Ranik very shortly. Frankston Council CEO Phil Cantillon has announced his resignation after 6 years in the role and more than 7 at the council. He says he'll finish up next month and will be taking a break after 40 years in public service, including roles with state governments in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. Dominic Cook has been elected as a councillor at Golden Plains Shire Council in Accountback. Mr Cook was the last eligible candidate standing after John Crow last week failed to return a declaration of eligibility within the required 48 hours. That vacancy on Golden Plains Shire Council occurred after the resignation of Councillor Brett Cunningham. Candidate nominations are now open for Darebin Council's North West Ward and the City of Whittlesea's Lalor Ward by-elections. Nominations close at 12 noon next Tuesday. There are concerns that building surveyors in Victoria are increasingly bypassing strict local requirements by obtaining qualifications in Western Australia. The Age this week reported data that shows 60% of new surveyors in 2024-25 were registered through the interstate loophole. It's raised concerns about inadequately qualified professionals being responsible for building safety inspections, potentially undermining Victoria's standards. Mornington Peninsula Shire Council has implemented new security measures requiring pre-registration for council meetings after recent alleged assaults against staff members. It joins other councils like Darebin, Casey, Hobsons Bay and Yarra Ranges to have security measures in place for council meetings. The City of Ballarat has been fined nearly $10,000 by the EPA, which issued an infringement notice after sediment from construction works at Chisholm Street Reserve overflowed into the Yarrawee River. The overflow occurred following rainfall in March, despite the council having best practice controls in place. The City of Stonnington has approved an 18-month trial to reduce speed limits to 30 kilometres per hour along Chapel Street and several other high-traffic streets in Melbourne's southeast. A postcard survey of 60,000 residents generated a response of just 1.3%, with 40% of those respondents supporting the lower limit. A review commissioned by Hume City Council following 2 serious dog attacks in Sunbury last August has found that while council staff acted appropriately, they were significantly constrained by current state laws in their ability to prevent such incidents. The council is now implementing several changes, including creating a dedicated animal management team and advocating for stronger legislative powers. And Swan Hill Rural City Council is highlighting a critical shortage of early childhood educators in the region, with only 1 childcare place available for every 3 children under 5. It says the shortage is expected to worsen with upcoming Victorian government reforms. The local TAFE is actively recruiting qualified early years teachers and offering incentives to address the pressing workforce need. That's the latest from VLGA Connect News for this week. A little later in today's show, Matt Collins is here. Matt is the CEO of the Planning Institute of Australia. They've recently released the results of a nationwide survey on the impact of a shortage of planners. What is happening to address that? We'll talk with Matt about some suggestions and measures that are being taken. But right now, it's time to catch up on some of the big stories of the past few weeks with our special guest, Tony Ranik from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Always great to catch up with Tony Ranik, who's with me now. It's been a couple of weeks since we saw you, Tony. How have you been?
Well, I've been cold, Chris. I've been cold
Yes,
like most of our listeners. If they're in Melbourne, they've probably felt the wave of winter coming across.
it's hit
But
with a vengeance, hasn't it?
absolutely,
Yeah. As we
Got-
record this, they're all packing their bags for Canberra next week. I think that might challenge even Victoria for the
Ooh, I hope
cold.
no early morning meetings in Canberra. That could be nasty.
I think they're more likely to be late night
Oh,
meetings,
okay. Oh.
Tony. Yeah, that's my guess anyway. All right. In all seriousness, a lot happening around the sector that we need to catch up on. Have you caught up on what happened at Yarra this week? There was a notice of motion on the books from the mayor there to pursue some legal, or at least get some legal advice on what action they could take against the government on this emergency services fund levy. Where did that get to?
Yeah, I did. I actually tuned into the meeting on Tuesday night, Chris, and that notice of motion from Stephen Jolly, the mayor, was successful. It had a number of elements to it, but yes, as you say, writing to the state government expressing council's opposition to the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund, including a message on the council rates notice that, this is a state government levy and something that council opposes,
Yeah.
and then seeking legal advice from, another organisation not connected to state government as to whether council can actually refuse to
Yeah.
request the levy. So a number of arms to this motion was ultimately passed. There were two councillors who voted against, but quite a significant move from Yarra. And what I thought was interesting, Chris, an inner city council, and we might have thought, the councils most affected and agitated are those with rural communities,
Yes.
farming communities. But at least in the debate, one of the things that came out through the mayor was that these increases would still have an impact on residents and businesses in Yarra. In fact, an average median increase for residents of 32% was what he quoted, and about 80%, I think it was, for businesses. And also that there's a collection cost for each
Yes.
council, something we haven't perhaps thought of. Knox has apparently estimated the cost at 200,000 per annum in the city of Knox.
Wow, that's significant,
For
isn't it?
collecting, and well,
Yeah.
at least that was what was quoted in the debate at Yarra.
Right.
I
Okay.
haven't had that verified, but so yeah, impacts across the sector, including in the metropolitan areas, it would seem.
Yeah, I think some of the advocacies has been around the government covering those collection costs, whatever they might be. I made the point a couple of weeks ago, Tony, that the metros had been pretty much silent on this while the rurals and the regionals were making the running. But that's starting to balance out with the likes of Yarra and Knox making those comments. I noticed in the press, Hobson's Bay was approached for comment, and they've sort of kept it at arm's length for the moment. That's because they were mentioned in a radio interview by Stephen Jolly in talking about what he wanted to do here. Cardinia, another one. It's not going away, and I see every day, I think, another statement from another council to say that they are still holding the line on this. They want changes. And you make a good point too about the costs on city residents and businesses. That pause the government's announced, as I understand it, is only on primary producers. So the increase will come in for other ratepayers this year.
Yeah, and I think there's also the precedent nature of this concern about moving into a so-called levy. Um, the collection of taxes or costs that normally are collected just from consolidated revenue. So things like the salaries of bureaucrats, or triple zero, the operation of, say, the triple zero
Mm.
platform and all that. Some of that is coming out of this levy. Normally would have come out of consolidated revenue.
Right. Okay. Make the point again. Of course, the levy's been in place, but it's the increase under this new legislation that is of concern. Let's put that one to one side. I'm sure we'll be coming coming back to that in the future. The big one this week was Merri-bek's announcement, the mea culpa, that they discovered an error that goes back over a decade in the way it had been applying parking fines for some infringements, not those under the Road Safety Act, but some others where they had some discretion, they thought, but they didn't have a council resolution in place. Therefore, they've got a huge refund scheme about to launch.
That's right, Chris. So how the legislation works, it's a discretionary range of penalties ranging from zero point 0.2 penalty units to 0.5. And council are legally able to charge up to 0.5 penalty units for these types of infringements, provided there's that council resolution in place that you referred to. And if you don't have the resolution in place, then the default charge is the 0.2 of a penalty unit. So what's been discovered at Merri-bek is that they've been charging the 0.5 for these 11 categories of parking infringements without the formal resolution being in place for infringements from 1 July 2013 to 11 June 2015. So that's been a administrative error. I think the council's doing the right thing here, is being proactive, not waiting to be told of the error. They've discovered the error themselves, and I believe and have taken the initiative to offer this refund scheme. It's an opt-in scheme. So
yeah, I think just to your point about them moving quickly, I think the announcement was this week of the refund scheme and the discovery of the error, and it applies to fines that were issued up to Wednesday of last week, I think it was. So, in the scheme of local government bureaucracy, that's moving pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's this scheme's going to be open for 12 months. According to media reports, there's about 250,000 fines that could be affected by the error. And so the potential, aggregate refund, again, according to media reports, is this between 10 and 12 million. One would expect it's probably going to ultimately be less refunded because, will everyone who received a fine apply for a refund? No, there'll be people who were passing through the municipality won't be aware of the refund. But Chris, not at all unprecedented that there would be issues with collecting parking infringements.
Yeah, we've had some
fines.
recent examples, haven't we? I do recall the Victorian Ombudsman took issue with a small number of councils and the way they'd managed their parking fine system just a few years back.
That's right. In 2020, it was Glen Ira, Port Phillip and Stonington who had to refund almost $20 million after the Vic Ombudsman found that they'd used private contractors to settle parking ticket disputes, and that breaches the Infringement Act. But that same year, Melbourne City Council also faced some criticism from the Victorian Ombudsman and had to refund, because what was happening there was that drivers who had made a simple error in attempting to pay the parking fee, but had mistakenly entered their registration number, confusing the letter O with 0.
Right.
So easy to do.
Yeah.
They had been fined, and the Ombudsman was critical of that, and there needed to be a refund. Back in 2019, City of Monash had to pay back 2.6 million, again using a contractor to rule in relation to infringement appeals. So Merri-bek aren't one out on this. It's been a common problem for councils, and any CEOs out there or managers of local laws, etc., out there listening, going back and perhaps having a look at, have we got those resolutions in place, or are we exposed, would be a good idea, because I suggest there'll probably be some other people out there who will be seeking that information.
That's the thing with these instances. They're cautionary tales, aren't they? And it begs going over your own processes to make sure everything is in order. I can just imagine the sick feeling in the stomach the person who discovered this in the first instance must have had in following this through and reporting it up the chain. I feel for them. And I think Kathy Henderson and the mayor there, Helen, have done, as you say, absolutely the right thing. They've fronted the media. They've said, look, we made a mistake. We're being transparent about it. We're moving as quickly as we possibly can to rectify it. And importantly, they've apologised profusely for the impact of this. I'm not sure there's anything more they could have done in this situation.
Yeah, good on them. I think they've done absolutely the right thing.
Indeed. All right. I want to close the loop on a couple of things, Tony. After last year's election, we know about the Whittlesea decision from
Mm.
VCAT, which means there's a by-election coming in the Layla ward, I think it is, and those nominations have opened this week, as well as
Mm.
nominations for the Darebin by-election. But there were two other matters on foot that have now been resolved. Let's deal with Knox firstly,
Yeah.
because that one was another case where the VEC referred some suspected fraudulent activity to VCAT.
That's right. So we had a VCAT order made just earlier this month on the 5th of June by Vice President Judge English. And what happened there in Knox in the 2024 election, Chris and viewers, was that there were 5 candidates in the Baird ward. And on the counting of first preference votes, no candidate had an absolute majority. So the usual process was counting preferences, and ultimately second, third, and fourth preferences were distributed before anyone had an absolute majority. And after the distribution of those preferences, Peter Lockwood received the most votes, being 377 votes more than the second place candidate, Yvonne Aldred. But
Mm.
the Electoral Commission identified some irregularities with the number of declaration envelopes, number of multiple returns of declaration envelopes. So there's a process, Chris and viewers, where electors can request a replacement ballot paper.
Yeah.
And we can understand how that might happen. You know, a ballot might get left in a letterbox and get wet, or you might fill it out wrong and destroy it, or some accident might happen.
Yep.
And a declaration then can be made to receive a replacement ballot paper. But in this instance, the VEC has tracked that there were multiple ballot papers returned for the same voter, including a pattern of, on declarations, incorrect dates of birth and the same handwriting on multiple ballot paper returns. So the VEC applied to VCAT for a review of the declaration of results of the election, and 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 VCAT was satisfied that yes, there was attempted an actual influence here, in that there were some fraudulent votes lodged, but um, that and one of the unsuccessful candidates did receive 29 votes in his favour that were fraudulent. That was a Mr.
Right.
Church. That was the ruling of VCAT. But this didn't affect the outcome of the election, since he still would have been excluded in the second round of preference distributions. And the 29 fraudulent votes, wouldn't have affected the result for any other candidate. So the interference in voting did exist in that ward, but it didn't affect the result of the election, according to the VCAT decision. And Mr. Lockwood remains the elected councillor. There'll be no by-election. So we contrast that with what happened, as you say, in Laylaw ward in Whittlesea, where, in fact, the results were much closer
Yeah.
there, as I recall, and it was determined that the multiple voting could well have affected the outcome of the election.
In both of those cases where VCAT has said there was interference, is there likely to be some follow-up action?
That's interesting. So when the VEC identified the anomaly with votes, it reported that to the Victoria Police in all those instances, and there were police investigations. Whether there'll be charges laid against individuals, I don't know. It's, I guess, a matter of proof as to who is behind that fraudulent voting issue in those various councils. Chris, I'm not sure.
Okay, we may or may not hear more about that down the track. Now, there was another VCAT decision, and I must admit I had missed that this was going on. It was a request for a recount in a ward at Latrobe City Council, which has been ultimately denied. But what was the story behind this one?
Yeah, this is interesting. So your Lawn ward, again in those November elections, and so there were only 2 candidates in your Lawn ward. And on the first count of the votes, Graham Middlemiss, he's a 27-year veteran of council. He was re-elected by the very slim margin, defeating Steph Morgan by 3 votes.
Wow.
So the VEC have this recount policy that allow them to initiate a recount when there's a close margin that's identified. And so they went to a recount, and guess what, Chris? On the
It
recount,
flipped. It
different
flipped.
outcome.
Yeah.
Steph Morgan wins, but again by a very tight margin, 4 votes.
Oh my goodness.
So Mr. Middlemiss requests a third count, so another recount. However, the VEC refused to do that additional recount. And so, not surprisingly, perhaps, this led to an application to VCAT for review, not by the VEC this time, but by 10 persons entitled to vote in the election.
Right.
So there are 3 ways an election decision can be challenged at VCAT. The VEC themselves can make an application within 14 days of the result being declared. A candidate can do that within that time frame, or a minimum of 10 of the electors in the ward in question. And that's what happened here. And the challenging electors argued that, well, when there's an original count of votes and a subsequent recount, and they lead to 2 different outcomes, there should automatically be a third count, a deciding count, that's to be regarded as,
Best
2 out of
3.
3 wins, like we might do when we're playing a game in the schoolyard.
Yeah.
But I understand that. But the VEC argued, well, we can't have a process like that, a requirement that every time there's a close margin in an outcome, there's automatically a recount. If we did that, we might be in this perpetual recounts, because there are, of course, close outcomes.
Yeah, well, what if the third one had gone back the other way by, say, 2 votes?
That's right.
Where does it end?
And just and mere closeness of results doesn't indicate that's an invalid process. In fact, there were 16 close election results last November, and also the VEC argued, and I think I'm sort of happy with this argument. They argued that we need to be mindful of the cost of recounts. The cost of recounts is borne by the council, or indeed ultimately the ratepayers. And so VCAT agreed here, dismissed the application. That single recount result stands, and Steph Morgan remains a councillor in Latrobe City Council, Chris.
Yeah, a good point. Those recounts will go on to the final bill that the council would receive from the VEC for conducting the election. I've heard recently that New South Wales councils are getting their bills from that state's electoral commission. There's a bit of bill shock from some of those elections being experienced. That's really interesting. Thank you for closing the loop on that one, Tony. Hopefully that's the end of any question of any of the results out of last year's elections, bar this by-election that's coming up in Whittlesea.
Yeah, one would think so, Chris, given the timeframes for lodging appeals. I don't know of any that are still in the system.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Always great to have your insights there on those issues. Lots to catch up on. Are you going to be joining the local government convoy up the highway to Canberra next week, Tony?
No, I'm not. I'm on a little convoy myself to a few different councils around the place, but no, I'm not off to Canberra. But best of luck to all those who are, advocating for our sector up there. Important role.
Yeah. Before I let you go, we did get a little bit of feedback from our discussion about the Commission of Inquiry at Whittlesea on how that's going to be run. A lot of people, I think, really found that a useful explanation of what's going to play out there. One thing we didn't cover in the conversation, and we had talked about it previously, was the cost. The cost that will be borne by the council to run that inquiry. I've heard estimates that it could be $2 million or more. Tony, do you think that's a fair number to be?
Yeah, well, we're talking about the commissioners that sit in their fees. We're talking about the support the commissioners will get from the Victorian government solicitor. We're talking about then those councillors who are called to appear, and do they receive an indemnity for their costs? And indeed, we're not just talking about the mayor. I imagine a range of councillors and indeed council officers would likely appear before that commission. So I'm not sure if it's 2 million, but it would be very substantial. And even minor matters, conduct matters, for example, do have an expense. And we saw in the last week, I was watching your own local government news report, Chris. Baw Baw Shire, that process whereby the mayor was suspended for a month costs the Shire, I think, about $4,000.
Or more, six and a half, almost
six and a half. There you go.
Yeah.
So not insubstantial costs for a municipality.
Absolutely right. And while you were just saying all of that, it just occurs to me, I think Whittlesea's adopted their budget this week. I imagine there's got to be a line in there to account for this inquiry coming up. So perhaps if I'm feeling masochistic enough, I can go delving to find out. Or maybe someone watching can save me the trouble and just let us know what they're estimating for the cost. It's significant, and it's something that should be remembered as the real cost of these governance processes.
Well, you're right, Chris. There are so many services and capital works improvements that are demanded across the sector, and so there is an opportunity cost in lease expenditure.
Yep, spot on. Thank you, Tony. We'll let you go. Catch up with you again very soon. I'm sure there'll be something new to talk about in the next few days. So all the best to you and the team at Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, and thanks for your ongoing support for VLGA Connect.
Much appreciated.
Well, the Planning Institute of Australia recently released the results of a comprehensive survey of more than 1,000 planners, which confirmed what we already know. There's a deepening crisis of urban planner shortages across the country. And I'm joined now by the CEO of the Planning Institute of Australia, Matt Collins, to talk about that survey, its results, and what can be done to address the issue. Matt, welcome to the program.
G'day, Chris.
Great to meet you. You're in Brisbane. You've been heading up the PIA for a couple of years now, I believe.
I have been based in Brisbane, but certainly work all over the country on really important issues for planning and planners.
Yes, and this one in particular, I'm sure, has been the top of your KPI list, perhaps from day one. Would I be right?
Absolutely. We are seeing a real shortage of planners right around the country, and it's certainly something that has really grown as a problem over the last couple of years. It's something that's very much front and centre for the Planning Institute, and I know for local government as well.
We had Shane Sarley on the program recently, who's the chair of Regional Cities Victoria, talking about the impact of this across Victoria. But it is a national issue, isn't it? Is it completely across the board as far as Australia's concerned?
It's not the same everywhere. And we know that conditions can vary based on where you're located. We definitely hear really significant problems in regional and remote Australia. And we see the problem in cities as well, but it certainly varies by market. The best judge we've got is some data that was released last year by Jobs and Skills Australia, which is the federal government's independent workforce agency. And what they found was that urban and regional planners were in national shortage. And they were either in shortage or in a regional shortage in every state and territory except New South Wales. Right. So that was October last year. They released that every year. And certainly the information that we hear and the anecdotal stories we hear really tells us that we expect that that's continuing and certainly persistent today. And that's one of the reasons, Chris, we undertook that survey in the last couple of months to really better understand the dimensions of the issue.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because clearly we know about the problem. So I was going to ask what you're hoping to find from surveying your own planners. But what did you find, and where does this take you as far as the discourse on the issue goes?
Well, we did a survey throughout March and April this year of the planning profession to really get a better sense of what was going on out there when it came to the shortage of planners. And we had a really strong response. We had more than 1,000 planners give us their insights about their own experience of the shortage. A top line figure, what that told us was nearly 2/3 of respondents said the organisation that they came from had really struggled to fill planning roles in the past 12 months. That was both existing roles and new roles.
Mm.
The biggest barrier to recruitment, according to the survey respondents, was just a lack of qualified candidates. So there's just not enough planners out there. And nearly half of planners also think that this is directly affecting Australia's housing affordability and supply. So we know that there's really significant on-the-ground impacts potentially arising from this. Of course, many other reasons why we have a housing crisis, but certainly the shortage of planners doesn't help.
So for those who perhaps don't understand how the system works, why is that an issue for delivering housing and infrastructure on the ground?
Well, planners do lots of really important roles in the housing system. They assess development proposals to ensure that they comply with the regulatory requirements. They also write and prepare the long-term visions for future communities, which gives the housing sector certainty about how and where they can go. It also provides the certainty about how and where infrastructure should be invested in as well. So the role of planning in the housing system is really, really important. And if we don't get every part of the housing system working, we obviously can't tackle this really big issue for Australia.
Given that, pretty much every government around the country is talking about housing as one of their biggest issues, and they're calling on councils to do more, and that's a whole other debate about, who's actually responsible for the delay in delivering housing. Why aren't we seeing more government attention on this issue of planners?
Look, we certainly have seen governments take a real interest in it, particularly local governments who are on the front line and understand the issue. They employ a lot of planners, and also state governments as well. We timed this survey to try and really elevate this to be more of a national conversation as well, given as it was during the federal election. And it's something we're going to continue with the re-elected Albanese government going forward. But we know governments have already started to take some action. We'd like more. But we've seen things like, for example, the New South Wales government work with councils on a strong start program, which effectively funded local governments to employ cadets to study planning and also work in local governments. We've seen the South Australian government invest in a new undergraduate planning course at Flinders University. And so there's a lot going on, but we think more needs to be done.
On that university angle, this has come out in your survey discussion. 13 universities have closed their planning degrees in the last 8 years. So from a pathway perspective, it seems to be going in the wrong direction.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's something that we are deeply concerned about. One of our jobs at the Planning Institute is to accredit Australia's university planning courses. So we've seen really directly the impacts of declining enrolment and course closures affecting that pipeline of future planners. It's partly why we think we now have a shortage of planners, and we worry that the ongoing course closures are only going to exacerbate that. We recently launched a big campaign called Become a Planner, which we are taking out to high school students. We're taking out to career fairs to really encourage and inspire that next generation to see planning as an important career choice. When we were developing that campaign, Chris, we worked with some marketing advertising experts, and they did some market research, and what they came back and told us was not a surprise, but it confirmed that when people know what planning is, they love it. They get to tackle some of the really great big problems facing Australia, like housing, like climate, like resilience. But too many people just don't know what a planning career is. And so we're really working hard to elevate awareness of that with particularly high school students in the first instance.
A bit of a chicken and egg thing, isn't it? If they can't get to courses that deliver these planning outcomes, I guess kids aren't going to look at it as a serious option unless something changes there.
Absolutely.
So your survey also talks about the increasing workloads on the people that are in the system now, and that's manifesting itself in the hiring of less experienced people. What sort of problem do you see that causing, and how do we address that?
Look, I mean, we think that the challenges there around workload are a big one, and it's why we see planners sometimes reporting burnout. It's why we see sometimes planners leaving the profession, which obviously then only exacerbates the shortage of planners that we are facing. And we know from the survey data that some of the impacts that shortage are causing are, as you said, sometimes we see hiring staff with less experience than desired. That can just mean that things sometimes slow down as new staff get trained and skilled up. It can sometimes mean that staff positively get to take on new and bigger projects than they might otherwise have had access to earlier in their careers. It's really important, though, that we wrap around the skills to do that. We've been standing up a lot of new training courses through the Planning Institute to make sure that we can support early career planners and mid-career planners to have the skills they need to perform effectively in the workplace. And that's something we'll continue to do. But it is a challenge to ensure that we have the right skills in the right places to make sure we're getting great planning.
And I guess there's an issue about upgrading skills as new issues emerge, like, climate change, the housing crisis we've talked about, increasing densification. That's got to be an issue as well.
Look, absolutely. I mean, planning and planners have always operated in a pretty dynamic and fast-changing environment. We've seen GIS come in. We've even seen computers come in that have in the last 20 to 40 years. It's a hugely changing environment, like so many jobs. As we look to the future too, as well as those issues, Chris, that you've just highlighted, there will be really significant change to planning systems brought about through artificial intelligence. And we already see councils and state governments starting to experiment with how AI can help support planning systems. We think if that's done well, that's actually an opportunity too, because planners don't need to be spending some of the time they spend on low risk things. They don't need to necessarily be box tickers. That's not why people become planners. They want to make an impact on their community. They want to shape the future. And so we know that if AI can actually take some of those rote tasks off the day-to-day job of a planner, that can really elevate the role of the planner and ensure that the profession is really creating the value we know that it can and does for Australian communities.
Yeah, you raise a good point, and I don't think there's any future-focused conversation happening around local government right now that doesn't in some way include AI. What about beyond Australia, Matt? Is there anywhere you can look to for guidance on how this challenge is being addressed elsewhere?
Look, I talk to my colleagues around the world at other planning institutes, and particularly in a lot of the developed countries like the US, like Canada, like the UK, where we have similar planning systems. They are all struggling with similar issues of planner shortages as well. So it is a global phenomenon, and it's one that we are all talking about continuously, and including how do we make sure that the future of professional development and the future of university courses are preparing graduates and preparing the profession for the world that we're all going to be operating in.
A hot topic of discussion, I imagine, just recently in Darwin when you had your national Congress, Matt.
Absolutely. And we had a really great discussion on the main stage there with 4 heads of planning from state from state governments. And all 4 of those heads of planning were highlighting both the issues that we've talked about now in terms of AI and how that can elevate planning, but also very much focused on the shortage of planners and what that means for them in their own planning departments as they seek to lead pretty big reform agendas as well. And it's a tough environment, Chris.
Yeah. Is there some confidence, though, some positivity about being able to deal with this and move through to the other side?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know that planners are fundamental to Australia's future, that we, as a profession, are really critical to helping tackle really big challenges and wicked problems that face so many communities. And planners are a pretty positive bunch because we're in the business of imagining the future, of dreaming what can be. So we know that the profession is very much working to adapt. The profession is very much looking at what we can do to overcome the shortage of planners. We think that there's a way forward. We think there's not a single silver bullet. And we also know, though, that as this housing challenge rolls on, governments are more and more seeing the need to tackle this shortage as well and to figure out solutions to it.
Well, it's been great to talk to you about it, Matt. How can people find out more about your survey, about the Become a Planner campaign, or any of the other elements we've talked about today?
Absolutely. Look, we've released the survey results on the PIA website under the news section, so that's planning.org.au. And we'd love anybody who wants to support the Become a Planner campaign to get involved. There's more information at becomeaplanner.com.au, including the opportunity for councils out there, who I know a lot of your listeners, Chris, to get involved in the campaign by co-branding with us to help promote the website to students in their own local government areas.
Fabulous. Matt Collins, CEO of the Planning Institute of Australia. Thanks for coming on VLGA Connect.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Great to talk to Matt, and thanks also to Tony Ranik, my other guest on today's edition of VLGA Connect. We've covered a lot of ground again, and I hope you've found that useful. Before we go, a note from the VLGA about the next Global Executive Panel, which is coming up on the 22nd of July. The topic is growing the local economy. What is the role of local government in economic growth? How do we future-proof our solutions to ensure local economic planning remains resilient to economic changes? And how can you ensure that the whole local area benefits from local economic growth initiatives? CEOs and sector leaders will be joining the panel to discuss that topic on the 22nd of July from across the world, in fact, because this is the VLGA and LGIU combining to bring you another global executive panel. As I say, the 22nd of July, 5:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. You can find out more and register your place on the VLGA website now. Thank you for joining us for another edition of VLGA Connect. We'll be back with much more next week. Until then, bye for now.